Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing How Much Do Elections Matter, with Sanford Levinson, scholar of constitutional law and currently a visiting professor of law at Harvard University. I'm Pat Zerke, director of the forum. The United States recently held midterm congressional elections, which were widely viewed as critical in determining the agenda for the next 2 years. Most citizens see voting in elections as a major duty of citizenship and a primary means of expressing their wishes for the country's future course of action. And political parties and the media focus almost exclusively on elections as the source of the nation's governing mandate. Why then don't elections make more difference in the policies and activities of our government? This is the question our speaker will be addressing tonight. Sanford Levinson is the W. St. John Garwood and W. St. John Garwood Centennial Chair at the University of Texas at Austin School of Law, and is currently a visiting professor of law at Harvard University. His research and teaching have focused primarily on the United States Constitution. He is the author of more than 250 articles and book reviews in popular and professional journals. He has also authored or co-authored 4 books, most recently, Our Undemocratic Constitution, Where the Constitution Goes Wrong and How We the People Can Correct It. Out of this understanding of our constitutional foundations comes his provocative question for our discussion: how much do elections matter? Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Sanford Levinson.
Yes, thank you very, very much, those of you who are here this evening and anyone who happens to be watching or listening later. I'm very grateful to be here. With regard to the overall topic of the series, which I gather is renewing democracy, from my perspective, the very real question is whether it is a question of renewing democracy, which suggests that there was once a democratic America that we have fallen away from, so our task is to return to it, or whether it is really constructing for the first time what Alexis de Tocqueville in some ways erroneously called democracy in America. It was certainly democratic from his perspective as a French aristocrat, seeing a very different sort of society, but whether it's democracy is something else. Let me put this in the context of the book that was mentioned, Our Undemocratic Constitution, and a very common reaction, which I didn't entirely expect, but I suppose I should have. I also should back up for a moment and say that the original title that I suggested the Oxford University Press was Our Broken Constitution. And I was informed that basically one can have only one broken book per year, and that year they had published the very, very interesting book by Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann called The Broken Branch, a thoroughgoing and well-merited critique of our contemporary Congress. So I had to find another title. I said, okay, Our Undemocratic Constitution, because that also certainly fit my general argument. But there is a very interesting difference I discovered between those two titles. If the argument is that the Constitution is broken or dysfunctional, that leads to a certain kind of conversation. That is, what is it we expect the Constitution or our political institutions to do? And then we can simply match how they are in fact functioning with whatever we conceive of as a well-functioning constitutional order. And to the extent that it is broken or dysfunctional, we can agree or disagree, and then we could try to figure out what remedies might be. But that's not the title of the book. The title of the book is Our Undemocratic Constitution, and thus I say the surprise that I received was a number of people Some of them very courteous, others, I have to say, dripping with a certain kind of condescension, who would ask me, didn't I realize, I who profess to be a professor, after all, didn't I realize that we were never intended to be a democracy? It is well known that the Constitution nowhere includes the word democracy. It includes a very different word. In Article 4, it commits us, or at least it commits the national government, to guaranteeing in every state a republican form of government. And if one reads the debates of the 18th century, you certainly discover that almost everybody who didn't become a loyalist and flee to Nova Scotia or Great Britain or the like, but the people who stayed in Cambridge did believe very, very much in a republican form of government. But they very often contrasted a republican form of government with democracy, to the detriment of democracy. If you read The Federalist, if you read most of the debates in Philadelphia, you discover that democracy, by and large, was synonymous with rule by a passionate, not very well-informed, not very knowledgeable, not very, I guess these are simply ways of saying the same thing, not very educated, not very cosmopolitan people. And the whole point of the Constitution was to try to create a system that would provide better government than that. And thus the whole set of debates about what a republican form of government might be. And the Electoral College, or the original vision of the Electoral College, certainly fit a certain notion of republican form of government. There would be some, perhaps, modest local participation in choosing electors, though that wasn't guaranteed. State legislatures could choose electors. But it would be the more cosmopolitan, the more knowledgeable people who would actually choose presidents, because there was no faith in popular democracy. The only one of the national institutions that was chosen in popular elections was the House of Representatives. The Senate, as is well known, indeed one of the more interesting features of the recently concluded campaign, is that you actually had some people running for the United States Senate who suggested that the electorate should not, in fact, be allowed to choose senators, but that we should return to the good old days of the original Constitution, when it was state legislatures that chose senators. This is changed by the 17th Amendment, and the 17th Amendment is, in fact, a very, very important change in the Constitution. And it's not merely that it made the choice of senators more democratic, it's also the case that it stripped the Senate, any defense of the Senate, I should say, of a plausible claim that it had anything to do with protecting federalism. Because you could argue that the old Senate was linked with protecting a distinctive set of federal sorts of interests, because after all, if state legislatures choose senators, then one would expect that the senators who might desire re-election would be very sensitive to the interests of the state legislatures, which would involve presumably preserving the autonomy of state government and resisting certain kinds of overreaching from the national government. Once senators are popularly elected, that's just eliminated, and the modern Senate is nothing more and nothing less than a very peculiar kind of affirmative action program for the residents of small states. It has nothing whatsoever to do with, say, defending federalism as a particular kind of political value. And the Senate obviously continues to be very, very important. But the Senate, as I say, originally was not ever intended to be popularly elected. The president was certainly not intended to be popularly elected. And of course, at a formal level, the president is still not popularly elected. That is, we vote for electors. And even at the informal level, we know that from the 2000 election, most notoriously, that there is an uncertain relationship, shall we say, between the popular vote and who it is who actually occupies the White House. It's also the case, and the 2000 election is not actually, may not be the most serious problem, because it is a function of the Electoral College system that you do not need. 2000 raised the issue of coming in first. There's a separate issue of whether you have to get majority vote in order to get to the White House, and the general answer is no. And the best two examples actually are Richard Nixon in 1968, in our lifetimes I should say, Richard Nixon in 1968, and then Bill Clinton in 1992, each of whom got to the White House with 43% of the vote. And that's obviously a fairly far distance from representing a majority. And one could go through other aspects. There is not, for example, a scintilla of direct democracy in the national Constitution, as in contrast with 49 of the 50 state constitutions. I should confess that I have recently become very interested in comparative constitutional law, and that the constitutions I'm most interested in comparing the United States Constitution with these days are not foreign constitutions, even though I think they are, in fact, very interesting, and that Americans have something to learn from looking at the German Constitution, at the French Constitution, the South African Constitution, etc. But I actually wish that Americans knew far, far more than they do about their state constitutions, because what one discovers is that the United States Constitution is not only an outlier in many important ways, particularly relating to the notion of democracy among, if you look at constitutions around the world, where almost all of the countries that we usually tend to identify ourselves with are more democratic along a number of different dimensions, including the relevance of elections, which I will turn to in a moment. But you discover that almost every state constitution is noticeably more democratic. Some people find it grotesquely more democratic, such as the fact that most judges in the United States are elected. They are not appointed. And one result of yesterday's election, for example, is that 3 judges in Iowa were defeated in a retention election, presumably as a retribution for having read the Iowa state constitution to protect same-sex marriage. There are also, notably in California, but not only in California, popular initiative and referendum. So you discover all sorts of breakouts of democracy in the American states, for better and for worse. I didn't like the result 2 years ago, or actually I think it was last year in Maine, when the Maine electorate overrode a statute passed by the Maine legislature and signed by the Maine governor with regard to legalizing same-sex marriage. But even cold, sober Maine, which is almost never thought of in the same breath with California, has a way by which we, the people of Maine, can take a direct part in governance, which might be one thing one means by democracy. For that matter, it could also fit within certain definitions of a Republican form of government, but that wasn't the notion of Republican form of government that was by and large operative in the 18th century. And one of my central arguments in the book is that we continue to an astonishing degree to live within the set of political institutions that was designed in 1787 under a set of explicitly anti-democratic assumptions where you wanted to limit the potential for popular passion and popular participation in politics, and that if one does actually wish democracy in America or a more democratic America, then there is a great deal of constitutional reform that is necessary. It is most definitely not a question of returning to the good old days unless you happen to agree that we ought to repeal the 17th Amendment and return the election of senators to state legislatures. So let's look at some of the features that make the elections yesterday, whatever one thinks of the outcome, less important than you might think it is. Compare, for example, the election yesterday, or for that matter, the election of 2008, with the recent British election. There was not a majority winner, in fact, in UK. You had a so-called hung parliament, and you now have, for the first time in several decades, a coalition government operating in the UK. But the real point is that that has led to really significant changes in the budget of the UK, potentially in the way that a whole number of very important social institutions and political institutions will operate in the United Kingdom. Apparently, one aspect of the deal to get the coalition government is to change a truly awful election system that we share with the United Kingdom, which is to rely exclusively on single-member districts with first-past-the-post winners. This simply means that there can often be a spectacular disconnect between the actual winners of elections and the percentages of votes they get and the overall distribution of votes. So that Margaret Thatcher, for example, was able to become the most important peacetime prime minister possibly in the entire history of the UK, but certainly in the late 20th century, by getting 42% of the vote. We often talk, of course, in this country of gerrymandering, named after Massachusetts' own governor, Elbridge Gerry. But even without gerrymandering, which simply accentuates the ability to get extra seats through the clever design of district boundaries, even if the boundaries are better written, there is no guarantee that you will get a parliament or a legislature that, in fact, reflects the general distribution of public opinion across areas, unless it just happens to be the case that different publics or different constellations of opinions just happen to be geographically distributed. Now, occasionally that's true. That was the case with slavery, for example. But much more often it's not true. The first past the post feature is simply that whoever comes in first wins. Now, that's a fine principle if you're running a foot race, but if you're trying to elect political officials, it's not clear why you should get a seat in the Senate, say, simply by getting 41% of the vote, which is the current vote that Lisa Murkowski apparently has in Alaska. This is not an argument against returning Senator Murkowski to the Senate. It does suggest, though, that it wouldn't be such a bad idea if there were a runoff system. If, in fact, you had to show that you had the support of a majority of the people in order to take a seat. Similarly, with regard to presidencies, I regard the election of both Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton as significantly flawed. I don't necessarily want to say illegitimate, but I will certainly say flawed insofar as neither one could demonstrate more than 43% of support. The most influential election probably in our entire history was the election of 1860, in which Abraham Lincoln got to the White House with 39.8% of the popular vote, but an electoral vote majority. So these are features built in to what I have taken to calling the hardwired Constitution that I believe need a great deal more scrutiny than we have given them. Indeed, I think that part of the well-known anger that is being ascribed to the American public largely these days, that is on November 3rd, 2010, to members of the Tea Party and the right wing, but I dare say that there are an awful lot of angry people who might identify themselves on the left as well, that the anger that is directed at leaders or the lack of leadership or the bad faith of people you happen not to like, that justified anger ought to be directed at our political system and at the Constitution, and not necessarily at particular political leaders you happen to be disillusioned in or you don't like. This is not to give political leaders a free pass, but it is to say that we should recognize the extent to which all of us, including very much those we call political leaders, and to some extent we should put scare quotes around the term leaders, are trapped in an iron cage that was designed in 1787, and with only modest exceptions, such as the 17th Amendment, has not been significantly changed since then. Let me say one other thing which might surprise you, given what I've just said. I'm obviously not a fan of our Constitution. Does that mean that I'm not a fan of the generation of 1787 that wrote the Constitution? And the answer is that doesn't follow. I don't think they were demigods. I don't think they were perfect. Nobody is. But I think that they were a remarkable group of people who did remarkable things in trying to respond to what they viewed as the exigencies of the moment, working with the very best political theory at one level, the empirical information, what we would today call comparative government, at another, to do their best to construct a political system that would achieve the truly wonderful goals laid out in the preamble. I'm a very harsh critic of the Constitution, but I love the preamble. I think the preamble is a wonderful and inspiring preamble, and I don't make that as a snide comment, because I think it is the preamble, after all, that tells us the purpose of engaging with one another in a political order, including a constitutional political order. And the set of purposes set out is a wonderful set of purposes. The problem is the extent to which what follows the preamble is functional or dysfunctional with regard to achieving those purposes. And I obviously believe they are dysfunctional. Now, let me make just a few more comments with regard to some of the prognostications after yesterday's election. It occurred to me as I was thinking of what remarks I wanted to make that one of the problems of listening to anybody on November 3rd is that everybody is spinning. If you're a Democrat, you're going to spin the election in one way. If you're a Republican, you're going to spin it in another. So what is my spin? My spin, I would hope, is not a particularly partisan one, though it doesn't take much tracking down of the internet to find out that I do have some distinctively partisan views. But my spin is to relate this to the Constitution and the problems I see with the Constitution, because that is what currently obsesses me more than what I would define perhaps as more narrowly partisan concerns. So either the good news or the bad news, depending on your own politics, is that yesterday's election is not likely to produce a brand new agenda of legislation that is going to pass and be turned into law, because the very point of the constitutional system as constructed in 1787 and not changed in any significant way even with the 17th Amendment since then, is to make it very difficult to pass legislation. That you begin with bicameralism, and a particular kind of bicameralism. There are lots of bicameral systems in the world. Most federal systems are bicameral. But we have, it's not a unique form of bicameralism, but it is a very particular form of bicameralism which gives each house a death grip veto over the other house. In some bicameral systems, there are ways of breaking deadlocks. Usually, it's the more popular house, more popular elected house, that can ultimately break a deadlock, sometimes by supermajority vote, sometimes because if a president or a chancellor, as in Germany, warrants that this is very important legislation. We can't break deadlocks. And so what we're going to see, if one actually detaches oneself and really kind of doesn't care about this country, but is just fascinated as a political scientist, then the next 2 years are going to be a version of what Robert Bork once very, very ill-fatedly called an embarrassment of riches with regard to sheer intellectual interest, because you have a House and a Senate that it is fair to say despise one another. And so that even if you get certain abilities to pass legislation in the House or to pass legislation in the Senate, putting the filibuster to one side, is there any reason to believe there will be conference committees that will be capable of functioning to pass decent legislation responsive to the genuine problems in front of us? And the answer is no. But let's assume for the moment, I mean, one of the things that Speaker-to-be John Boehner has announced is that H.R. 1 will be a bill to repeal the health bill. Let's assume, for sake of argument, that that's a good idea and that it gets a majority vote in the House, which it probably will, as a matter of fact. And let's assume, given that every single Republican in the Senate will vote to repeal, let's assume that there are enough scared Democrats in the Senate to decide, who are up for re-election in 2012, and Joe Lieberman is one of them, and might decide that discretion is the better part of valor and will vote to repeal the bill. Is that enough to get it on in the law books? The answer is no, because the President of the United States has a veto. And the President of the United States has one of the strongest vetoes in the entire world. It takes 2/3 to override the presidential veto, and 95% of all presidential vetoes are in fact upheld. And there is no plausible scenario that says that Barack Obama would sign a bill that would invalidate his signature accomplishment that in some ways he may very well have sacrificed his presidency to attain. We don't have a bicameral system, we have a tricameral system in this country. And we can see that in a variety of ways. And so, again, whatever one thinks of this on the merits, I suspect, given this is Cambridge, and certainly speaking for myself, I would be appalled if the bill were repealed, but it really doesn't matter whether I'd be appalled or not, because it's not going to be repealed. We have an institutional structure that guarantees that it won't be repealed. Now, will there be any sort of possibility of significant compromise between Congress and the President with regard to legislation on anything truly important? And I think the answer is no. I think that the proclamations by both Speaker-designate Boehner and President Obama that they look forward to working with one another and finding routes of compromise with one another is just demonstrably false. And I think it's demonstrably false for a reason that James Madison would have understood and in fact taught us, that neither Obama nor particularly the Republicans have any incentive to compromise with one another. And what any system of government is, as James Madison taught us, is, among other things, a system of incentives. The greatest single mistake the framers made, beyond perhaps being insufficiently committed to what we would today in the 21st century call democracy, is to assume there would be no political parties. And to assume that you could define the American system of government in terms of separation of powers. Darrell, I always say Darrell no relation Levinson, who formerly taught at Harvard, he's now back at NYU, and Rick Pildes, who's also at NYU, wrote a wonderful article called Separation of Parties, Not Separation of Powers. And they point out that the basic reality we live in is one of party government that really subsumes the importance of the Madisonian importance of separated powers. So let me translate this into why this election is not significant with regard to getting new legislation on the books, though it may be very significant in terms of explaining why there will be no legislation at all with regard to anything of significance. One of the lessons that Republicans certainly should have learned from the first Clinton administration and from the first Bush administration is that it is fatal to compromise with a president whom you want to beat in the next election. Bill Clinton was reelected in 1996, and he was reelected in part because he signed a welfare reform bill. We could argue all day about the merits of that bill, but there was, in fact, a compromise, and he signed it and trounced Robert Dole and maintained control of the executive branch. And one of the features, incidentally, of the American executive branch, in contrast, say, to the executive branch of almost every other state, of almost every state, including Massachusetts, is that executive branch elections are winner take all. If you're elected president, you get to appoint everybody in the executive branch, basically. Whereas, as all of you know, the governor of Massachusetts doesn't get to appoint the attorney general, doesn't get to appoint the treasurer, doesn't get to appoint the auditor, and it's not actually unusual for the governorship and the attorney generalship to be split in lots of states. In Texas, where I come from, we vote for every office imaginable, except for Secretary of State for some reason. And that means that the Texas governor has very, very little actual power with regard to staffing an executive branch. That's not the way we do it at the national level. So it means that it's very, very important to have control of the White House if you want to accomplish things and get control of administrative agencies. So all of our attention, I mean, all of the pundits are saying we're off and running already for the 2012 elections. So it's very, very important to get control of the executive branch. To do that, obviously, you have to beat the incumbent, assuming it's a first-term incumbent, and you don't do that by allowing the incumbent to have any achievements at all. I mentioned the Clinton election. There's also the Bush election. From my perspective, George Bush was elected in 2004 by Teddy Kennedy. That is to say, it was Ted Kennedy's decision to cooperate or collaborate, depending on whatever word you prefer, with George Bush over No Child Left Behind and prescription health coverage. Again, what everyone thinks of the bills really doesn't matter. But the fact is that George Bush was able to run in 2004 not simply by waving the banner of the war on terror, but also by saying that he was in fact capable of reaching across the aisle and getting productive and important domestic legislation. Republicans aren't going to do that with Barack Obama. They're not going to offer him anything that he can genuinely accept, because that would simply reelect him in 2012. So whatever they offer him, he either has to veto, because it will be so far away from anything he could genuinely accept, or he has to sign, but if he signs it, he should resign. Because, I mean, take the repeal of the health bill. If he were to sign such a bill, then he would be admitting that the election was as gigantic a vote of no confidence as could be imagined. And in any kind of, I don't want to say decent political system, because decent is the wrong word, perhaps I should say in any kind of coherent political system, anybody who suffers that kind of repudiation and accepts that degree of repudiation should resign, rather than to stay around and sign bills passed by the opposition party that by definition you think are really quite horrible. So this is why, this is the kind of politics that I think we can look forward to, if that's the proper term, in the next 2 years. And the point I would make is that I don't regard anybody in this story as evil. I think the Republican Party, under my scenario, is behaving perfectly rationally, in as much as their goal is to win the presidency back, because it's actually very important who controls the presidency for all sorts of reasons. And the rational way to achieve that goal, and Mitch McConnell, we should give Mitch McConnell credit. He actually has said this in public just last week or a couple weeks ago, that the number one item on his agenda is making Barack Obama a one-term president. Well, how do you do that? You deprive him of any accomplishments. It really is as simple as that. These are a variety of reasons, not why I think the election yesterday was unimportant. I don't think that. That would be truly silly. But why the election yesterday, and why most discrete elections are much less important than they are said to be at the time, if by importance and by democracy one means the ability to translate the preferences of the presumptive winners of the election into concrete legislation. All the stars have to be aligned perfectly for that to happen. One can argue that the last time the stars were aligned was the 2 years between 1964 and 1966, when in part because of the Goldwater campaign, there was an unusual degree of one-party government in the Johnson administration, and we got, for better or for worse, depending on your own political preferences, a huge litany of new programs. But just as in astrology, the planets come together only once every 40 years or 400 years, the nature of the American political system is that the various institutions come together only very rarely in a way that would allow ourselves in any serious sense in 2010 to call ourselves a functioning democratic order. So with those happy comments, I will conclude, and I certainly welcome any questions or comments.
Let me remind the radio audience, you're listening to Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion of how much do elections matter with Sanford Levinson, visiting professor at Harvard Law School. How does the Constitution itself limit democratic self-government? I have the opportunity to ask the first question, and I actually have many questions, but let me go to perhaps the biggest one. And that is the second half of the subtitle of your book. What can we, the people, do to correct our undemocratic Constitution?
I mean, here's where things go from bad to worse in many ways. Because what I advocate is a new constitutional convention. Larry Lessig, incidentally, also, I gather was a speaker here several weeks ago, also advocates a new convention. But one of the catch-22 features of the United States Constitution is that we have the most difficult to amend Constitution in the entire world. So a new constitutional convention would in fact require, at the very least, petitions of 2/3 of the states. But then it would require, presumably, going through the ratification process, which is supermajoritarianism run riot. Takes 3/4 of the states. So that is why, I mean, looking around the audience, in my lifetime at least, and I think in the lifetime of most people here, there's been only one arguably significant amendment to the Constitution. That's the 22nd Amendment that limits presidents to 2 terms. That's 1951. That obviously is coming up to 60 years ago. There have been some amendments since then, but none of them is of any great significance. And there are proposals for amendment, but quite candidly, nobody takes them seriously. The flag-burning amendment, the same-sex marriage amendment, are red meat to the base. They're not serious proposals that anybody believes will happen. Even more to the point, they don't speak to structural issues. Nobody speaks to structural issues. What drives me crazy, what makes me feel even myself increasingly simply like a crank, is that there are no leaders in the political system, nor, what really drives me crazy, are there any pundits who are talking about structural issues. They talk about defects in President Obama's leadership, or they talk about how beastly the Republican Senate behaves toward the president or whatever. But none of them link this in a very Madisonian way to the institutional structures within which we operate. So I'm not very optimistic. I'm one of the few people who was following especially closely last night and this morning elections in Montana, Iowa, Michigan, and Maryland, because 14 of the American states, including those 4, in their constitution give the electorate the ability every X years to vote for a new state constitutional convention. I am exceedingly sad to say that these proposals went down quite overwhelmingly in Michigan, Montana, and Iowa. It actually got a majority of the vote in Maryland of those people who voted on it. But I gather it may be the case that the Maryland procedure requires not merely a majority of the people who take a stand, but a majority of everybody who turned out to vote that day. So if you blank your ballot, you're doing the equivalent of voting no. So I'm one of these people who almost desperately wants some states, what Louis Brandeis once called little laboratories of experimentation, wants states to demonstrate the possibility of a serious constitutional convention today, that it's possible. There have been over 225 state constitutional conventions since the late 18th century. New Hampshire has had 17 of them. But there have not been state constitutional conventions now for about 25 years. And unfortunately, it may be that they went down even in Maryland. But the direct answer to your question is we begin with conversations about the Constitution, whether the Constitution is adequate. I will confess to being willing to give one cheer for the Tea Party, because this is an extremely interesting mass movement that began, to some extent at least, with very ordinary Americans, and I don't use that term pejoratively, who were upset and talked with one another and organized And interestingly enough, one of the things they're upset about, or some are upset about, is the 17th Amendment. But I would be deliriously happy if some of the people listening to us right now were to say, you know, maybe we ought to think about whether we're well served in 2010 by a set of institutions drafted by very, very able people, but 225 years ago. That's a start. But then, you know, ultimately you do have to address how almost literally incredibly difficult it is to change the United States Constitution.
Here at Cambridge Forum, we've talked a lot about elections and why they don't work the way we would like them to work. And people have talked a lot about nuts and bolts reforms. It doesn't sound like you believe any of those, changing the ballot, changing the voting machine, changing the day we vote, are really going to be effective in making elections important.
I support all of them, but they have literally nothing to do with changing, say, the peculiar form of bicameralism we have, and, you know, I haven't even gone through the litany of horrors about the United States Senate with regard to its anti-democratic features. And, you know, I would love for elections to use the very best voting machines, not to be so corrupted by money, et cetera. But I don't want to say it's beside the point. I just want to say that it has much less than we would like to believe to do with the deep dysfunctionalities of the American political system.
You're listening to Sanford Levinson discussing how much do elections matter. Let's take some questions from the audience. I see you've already lined up, so be succinct and let as many questions come out as possible.
Let me try two questions. As you know, many of us are terrified of the idea of a constitutional convention today, given the dysfunctional nature, the childish nature of much of our political leadership and what goes on. I'd appreciate it if you'd try to alleviate these concerns that cause the idea of another constitutional. I mean, we do not have the greatest generation in our history, of course, was not the World War II generation, but the founding fathers whom we both admire. My other question is a bit more complex to phrase, but the latest issue of Harvard Magazine has an excerpt from Professor Klopfenberger's new book about Obama's political thinking, and it, of course, reminds us that he, like yourself, has been a law professor, a teacher of constitutional law, who is very much concerned with issues involving the way our government and Constitution operate. I'm wondering if there's any hope, given his relatively unique background, I guess other than Woodrow Wilson, of providing some leadership in bringing about the structural changes you and I too would so much like to see. Thank you.
Yeah, I wish I could be more hopeful. I think that he would have to, you know, basically announce that he's not interested in running for re-election and really become a much more self-consciously transformative figure than he gives any indication of being. With regard to the first, it is certainly my experience that most of my friends and family get off the bus with regard to my call for a new constitutional convention. That is, they're very happy to agree with my critique of the Senate or my critique of this, that, and the other, and say, but you can't be serious in calling for a new constitutional convention. And the fact is that I am. I think that one of the deep paradoxes of the American system, and this goes back to my initial comments at the beginning, renewing democracy, is that the critique of a new constitutional convention at bottom, I would define as a profound rejection of the possibility of democracy. And for that matter, it's very much in line with many of the things one read at the end of the 18th century, where the descriptions of ordinary Americans was not very attractive. And the argument was precisely that you needed a well-chosen elite to make decisions that the people were basically incapable of making for themselves. That's not at all a dumb view. It may, in fact, be the correct view, but it's not democratic. And so we are caught in a certain tension. At one level, American presidents, certainly from Lincoln on, have embraced what I have taken to call the democracy project. That it's not merely government of and for the people, because a benevolent despot could do a wonderful job of providing government for the people, but rather government by the people. And then Wilson gets us into a war to make the world safe for democracy. George W. Bush and Barack Obama are as one in saying that it is a basic premise of American foreign policy to help the spread of democracy around the world. What in the world do we mean by this? Democracy becomes a fetishistic term that we really don't want to analyze, because if we do analyze it carefully, we might come to the conclusion not only that our own institutions are far from democratic, but that at a very deep level, we really don't want them to be more democratic. We really don't believe in democracy, because at some level, you really do have to have faith in we the people, a very naive and romantic notion. And quite frankly, even among my closest friends and family, I don't discern much faith. And of course, for many of my closest friends and family, yesterday's election did nothing to reinforce a faith in the people. But you have the anomaly in contemporary American politics that the right, particularly the radical right, is full of expressions of faith in the people, whereas what passes for a contemporary left is scared to death of the people. Now, as I say, again, this might be altogether correct as a political analysis, but it doesn't bode well for a political future that does, to some extent, depend on elections. Maybe not so much as we'd like to think, but on some extent depends on elections and popular participation. But I think I think your question is a very real question, and I think it really does get at the absolutely deepest problem of conceptualizing our political system and what we really want our political system to be. Yes?
Hi. Since my view of our legislature is that, like most people, they don't want to lose their jobs, and that's their prime concern. So what was the incentive of the legislature to pass the 17th Amendment? How did they think that that would ensure their continued employment?
There was actually a threat of an Article 5 Constitutional Convention. Article 5 actually says that you can have a new Constitutional Convention if 2/3 of the states petition for one. And it turns out that by 1912, enough of the states had moved to what is basically popular election of senators, that the state legislatures had agreed basically to be rubber stamps for popular primaries or popular elections, that they just had it with the relatively few mossbacks in the Senate. Needless to say, the House was delighted by doing whatever they could to wreck the Senate. That's a constant of American politics. And so you really had to demonstrate to members of the Senate that there might be consequences if they continue to hold off. And some people suggest that the potential consequence would have been a constitutional convention and whatever wild card features are associated with the constitutional convention. But your question is a very profound one, that we're all familiar, I presume, with Lord Acton's adage, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I actually prefer a version of this adage that I heard from John Roach, who was a political scientist and an aide to Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, where he said power corrupts and the prospect of losing power corrupts absolutely. And so, your question, why would members of the Senate actually agree to make themselves vulnerable? It's because they feared that even worse things might happen.
Thank you very much for your fascinating analysis. I wonder about two things. The national compact that some states have done to make the popular vote bypass the Electoral College. And since, as I understand it, the lifetime appointment of Supreme Court justices is not in the Constitution, what would it take to change that?
Well, again, both very good questions. Let me start with the last one first, or the latter one first. In my book, I rail against life tenure for Supreme Court judges. I'm more of an agnostic with regard to other federal judges. But here again is where the United States system is the outlier, not only in the world, but within the United States, where I think no state has complete and full life tenure except maybe Rhode Island. But even states that don't have term limits have age limits. I am in the minority of law professors, but you should know that I'm in a minority, who believes that good behavior, the Constitution does say you're entitled to tenure for good behavior, that I read good behavior as not being synonymous with forever and ever. I view it as a way of protecting judges against being impeached because you don't like their decisions, that you have to show that in order to impeach them that they were crooks or corrupt. I don't view an age limit or a term limit as a violation of the good behavior clause, because I think the purpose of the good behavior clause was to prevent political purges. But if we came to the conclusion that judges appointed in the future should serve only 18 years, which is my magic number, then my reading is that we could do that with legislation. But as I say, I believe most of my colleagues disagree, and even those who share my animus against life tenure would say that we have to do it by constitutional amendment. With regard to the first question, that is the so-called fair vote proposal, which would have the 11 largest states, because the 11 largest states in total have more than the 270 electoral votes needed to elect, that they would simply agree with one another to cast their votes whoever came in first. I like the idea that it's on the table because, as I indicated a few minutes ago, what I believe is most necessary at this juncture is any and all discussion about basic constitutional structures, whether I agree with a particular discussion or not. But I welcome the Tea Party critique of the 17th Amendment precisely because it generates a conversation about why we have the Senate at all, what the difference is between popular election and appointment by legislatures. They're not stupid when they say that the Senate doesn't protect federalism per se as much as it did. So I love the fact that the fair vote proposal is getting some press. It has even been passed in some states. The problem I have with it is that it's a response to 2000. It's not a response to 1968 and 1992. And I put it that way because it plays on the view that whoever comes in first should get to the White House. So, there are people who are justifiably angry to this very day, and I'm one of them, that Al Gore wasn't recognized as the winner of the 2000 election, which I think he was. But, that's a kind of crankish comment that has no operational value, because we all lived through 8 years of the Bush presidency. Massachusetts is so dependably blue, and Texas remains so dependably red, so there's no incentive for presidential candidates to come or to invest their campaign money in running up the vote, because it really doesn't matter whether you win Texas by 400,000 votes or 300,000 votes. Whereas in a different system, for all we know, George Bush would have invested millions of dollars in running the vote up. So 2000, even though it continues to make me angry to this very day, is not what I find most pathological about the Electoral College. The pathology is 1968 and 1992, where the candidates with 43% of the vote got to the White House, or frankly, the election of 1860, or the election of 1912. Some of these results you might like, some of them you don't. But that is why I would far, far prefer some sort of runoff proposal. Here I would suggest we would be well advised not only to look at France, but to look at Georgia within this country, where you do have runoffs. And it does mean that the person who gets to the White House or the OSA can make a plausible claim to have actually received the support of the majority of the electorate, whereas many of our presidents can make no such plausible claim. Because if we had a system, say, of rank order voting, the so-called alternative transferable vote, then you'd get different outcomes. So, I'm really glad that Fair Vote is promoting their reform. Every bit of discussion it gets, I think, is a good thing, but I don't think it is the cure for what is most seriously problematic about the Electoral College.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear you mention runoff voting, because that's part of what I was going to ask you about. But I first want to say, with all the adulation for the Founding Fathers, I'd like to just mention that I'm a little bit of a Daniel Shays man myself. For those of you who don't know, there was a Shays Rebellion in Western Massachusetts. And also, where you say that you don't think that anything's going to get accomplished now with this new Congress, I think you're missing something. Just as an aside, yes, something is going to be accomplished, and it's going to be more funding for the war and occupation in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And I think we shouldn't just overlook that. There's a lot of bipartisan agreement about continuing that misguided, to my mind, policy. And I bet you that's going to be continued. Republicans and Democrats will agree on that. On election reform, the three key reforms, you mentioned one of them, to my mind, some form of runoff elections, public financing of what are and should be public elections, and allowing for the public in our public elections to have the use of the publicly owned airwaves without having to pay for them, which is such an important part of this whole picture. And I disagree with you about how important money is in this, I think. But if you took those three reforms, public financing of public elections, a runoff, some form of runoff system, we just saw in Maine, very interesting. Right-wing Republican LePage won apparently with 38% of the vote, Cutler, the independent, 37%, and the Democrat, 20-something%. So there you have it. Those three reforms alone, I don't see how any of those are blocked by the Constitution, and I don't disagree that there are problems with the Constitution, but those three reforms alone Are there any constitutional obstacles to those, really? And I think you've sort of suggested that there may not be. If we did those three, wouldn't that make enough of a difference, and couldn't we begin to see a different Congress and a different political configuration?
I'm less optimistic. I mean, I have become, and this is one of the things that might make me something of a crank. I have become very wedded to a structuralist analysis of the Constitution that is skeptical that anything short of some fairly basic changes will provide us what we need. This doesn't mean that the suggestions you make might very well not make things better. But as I say, even if you got rid of any of the distortions that money generates in our politics, and I have no doubt that there are all sorts of distortions, it just wouldn't affect bicameralism, the Senate, the presidential veto, and the like. I certainly agree with you, incidentally, about Afghanistan. That is, I agree with you both in your own views of the merits or demerits of that enterprise, but also that the election is irrelevant to Afghanistan. I mean, as a lot of people pointed out, nobody from either party mentioned Iraq or Afghanistan in this campaign. I mean, you can regard this as just a remarkable exhibit of dereliction of public duty. And if Barack Obama wanted to pull out, he could. Congress cannot force him, realistically speaking, to stay in Afghanistan. And for that matter, you know, elections sometimes can be very interesting, however important they are. Rand Paul is actually a libertarian isolationist, or whatever the right word should be. So it will be extremely interesting to see what he decides to do with his new podium in the Senate with regard to a war. He's one of the very few candidates. He and his father, have both been quite militant with regard to the unconstitutionality, not simply the unwisdom, but the unconstitutionality of our recent wars. But the fact is, foreign policy is just very often orthogonal to elections because we either enjoy or are imprisoned in what remains a certain kind of, quote, bipartisan consensus with regard to major assumptions of American foreign policy or military policy. And that, by definition, means that elections aren't likely to be very decisive because the people running will pick so-called wedge issues. And foreign policy is rare, it's not that it's never a wedge issue, but it's rarely a convenient wedge issue.
It could be, but,
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Since you spend so much of your time or have reading state constitutions or foreign constitutions, I'm wondering what is the most democratic constitution in the world that you've come across? What is the most democratic state in the United States Constitution you've come across? And I also think I heard you say earlier in your talk, Professor Levinson, that 49 of our states had constitutions that were more directly democratic than the federal constitution. So that means of the 50 states, there must be an outlier, an undemocratic outlier, and I'd love to know what it is. So there are three questions for you to chew on.
Right. Delaware is the least democratic of the 50
First
states.
state to ratify is
Yep. It has no direct democracy at all. Every other state has some provision for direct democracy, usually, most obviously, in the ratification of proposed constitutional amendments. Delaware is unusual in not having that. I don't think there's such thing as a perfect constitution. I mean, that's not, you didn't ask me the most perfect constitution, but I think that all constitutions, all politics involves trade-offs and compromises. And, I mean, take the issue of life tenure for Supreme Court justices. If I were given a free hand to draft a new constitution, I'd get rid of it. But if you're willing to give me something that I want more, then I will quickly agree to continued life tenure forever and ever for Supreme Court justices if you'll allow me provisions to break deadlocks in bicameral system and things like that. But let me answer your question directly, a bit more directly. With regard to electoral systems, I'm a big fan of the German and New Zealand systems. Now, the New Zealand system, in many ways, was simply copied from the German system, because what both of those countries do is, from my perspective, combine the best of single-member districts and proportional representation, so that, let's say you have a 100-member legislature, 50 of them will be elected in single-member districts. And frankly, I don't know whether it's first past the post or with a runoff. But in a way, it doesn't matter. They'll be elected in single-member districts, but then you have 50 other seats to fill. Those are filled by a national party list system of election. And what gets really interesting is that you modulate the second group of 50 in line of the overall national distribution of votes. So what this means, simply, is if by a fluke you get 30 of the 50 original seats with only 50% of the national vote, but it happens to be the case because of the distribution of party members that you do especially well in this, then in the reallocation of the second 50, it will still come out 50-50. The advantage you enjoy from the single-member district component won't carry over. And I think this is a terrific system. For, among other things, it basically eliminates the incentive to engage in gerrymandering, because you can't translate a gerrymander into being able to prevail in the national legislature by getting less than a majority of the vote. California, though a lot of people don't like California, I think for good reason. I think California is very interesting with regard to the issue of democracy. I mean, part of what's crazy about California, I think California clearly has the most dysfunctional of all state constitutions, is that they have used their ability to engage in direct democracy in order to limit the power of majorities. So that California, I think, is the only state in the country that both allows direct initiative referendums to mandate certain sorts of spending and to require a 2/3 vote in the legislature to pass a budget. This is a recipe for complete and utter disaster. And this is exactly what you see in California. But if you look at the history of the initiative referendum in California, you discover, I mean, this is why, if you believe that money plays too great a role in politics, well, one response is to public finance or other ways of saying we're still going to conduct elections kind of the typical way we do, but we're going to try to limit the role of money. Another is to say, well, the best way is to, and this is the argument of progressives of the early 20th century, is by allowing more direct democracy and initiative referendum, then that provides the cure for the problems that had been exposed in representative democracy. Let me return actually to the question about a constitutional convention, because an important question always comes is, well, who would be the delegates to such a convention? And most often, the people who ask that question really have a terrifying image in mind of who the delegates would likely to be. And usually this comes because they believe that the delegates would be elected and that the elections would simply be an exponential version of everything we don't like about the current American political process, including the role of money, single issue candidates, and the like. Well, my solution is to return to ancient Greece, which is to say lottery selection, a national citizens jury, with some stratification in order, because statistically, you might find that everybody comes from California or Illinois or North Dakota, and so it would seem to me you'd want to put in some modest geographical barriers to make sure that that doesn't happen. But if, for example, you selected at random a sample of something like 750 American citizens to spend 2 years in systematic thought and hearings and debate about what would be a really functional constitution for the 21st century, with 750 people, you would have, X number of your worst nightmare, because that's just the kind of country we are. But the X would be a couple of dozen. It wouldn't be 200 or 300. This comes back to the point about whether we have a requisite faith in popular judgment. And, I confess I'd be willing to go with a national jury. I don't think that the issues we're discussing this evening are rocket science. You really don't need to have a graduate degree in order to understand some of the basic dilemmas and presented by different forms of political institutions. It's a question of what kinds of risks you're willing to run, what sort of risks you're most averse to. These are value judgments, and I think people engage in these arguments all the time, or at least some of the time, not enough of the time. But I think that they don't engage in these arguments more than they do because of a view that nothing can be done. Whereas if we did have this kind of citizen jury national convention, though ideally it would begin in Maryland and showing the possibility at states, I'm sure that C-SPAN would cover it. I'm sure it would be the ultimate in political reality television. And I don't mean that snidely at all, but you would discover people whom you identify with, who look like you, have genuinely interesting views, can work well with others, can engage in civil discussion. I would love to see that come about, but it is a vision of how political change might take place. But quite frankly, I know that it sounds very utopian or quixotic or flaky, because most people aren't willing to engage in the first step, which is a discussion like the one we're having this evening. And of course, one of the reasons they don't is because this is such a huge country. I mean, one of the debates in 1787 was whether you could have a so-called extended republic. Montesquieu and others thought that you could have a republican political order, and for our purpose, we could even make that synonymous with a democratic, Jeffersonian political order, that you could really have it only in a relatively small space. And I mean, this has always been one of the arguments for federalism. And Madison rather optimistically said, oh no, you could have an extended republic. But Madison was writing about a country that had 4 million people and where the extension was to the east bank of the Mississippi River. And it is a genuinely difficult question whether you can have a Republican form of government or a Democratic form of government. Those terms have nothing to do with contemporary political parties in a country of 310 million people, extending from the mid-Pacific to, depending on your view of Puerto Rico, to the mid-Caribbean. As any economist would point out, it's irrational to vote. Your vote is never going to be decisive in any election beyond dog catcher in a relatively small community. So voting really is an act of civic communion. And so people rationally choose to be interested in other things than in civic life because the odds of an affirmative payoff are so low. The virtue of lottery selection is that for these 700 people, this would be the highlight of their lives and what they thought really would matter. And then the question is whether we as the onlookers through C-SPAN would get involved and would create a national dialogue going well beyond simply the 700, especially given that the 700 couldn't write a brand new constitution and impose it on the rest of us. There would have to be ratification, and that would obviously require a great deal of extended discussion. Now, I'm sure this sounds very, very bizarre.
I was wondering, have you noticed less partisanship in parliamentary democracies? And secondly, why did the Founding Fathers choose a presidential democracy over a parliamentary democracy?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The honest answer is I haven't done enough study with regard to parliamentary systems versus our own. I would say that partisanship doesn't matter in at least a standard form parliamentary democracy because you expect an opposition party to oppose. But the point is that the majority can affect its will, and the next election will hold the governing majority responsible. And if they're tossed out, the new winners can do sometimes remarkable things, as we see over and over again in the UK. So I don't think you could plausibly say that there's distinctly less partisanship between the Tory and the Labour parties. And a lot of us, I'm sure, have enjoyed watching Question Time in the British Parliament, which can be quite savage, but it doesn't have the same valence if an opposition party in the Senate can simply block even bringing to a vote the program of the ostensible majority in the White House, the Senate, and the House because of a truly bizarre rule called the filibuster. Now, the Constitution certainly doesn't require the filibuster, and there are some arguments that the filibuster is unconstitutional. But I think it's not, what you're measuring is not partisanship, but the extent to which the political system is structured in such a way as to make partisanship more or less congruent with the ability to govern. And we have a system in which partisanship can destroy the ability genuinely to govern the United States. That's not the case in a classic parliamentary system. Her Majesty always has a government. Do we have a government right now? Are we going to have a government for the next 2 years? What are the criteria of having a government? What would count as evidence of having a government. We may have a government in certain senses or in certain ways, but are we going to have a government the way Her Majesty has a government? The answer is no. With regard to your other point, why do we have a presidential system? I think there are two answers. One is that a parliamentary government simply wasn't on offer in 1787. As a matter of fact, we know in retrospect that the United Kingdom was well on its way to developing what we call a parliamentary system. But the system they observed was a monarchy presided over by a tyrant, an alleged tyrant against whom we had engaged in armed revolt 11 years before, who was able, and here's where money is important, who was able to manipulate and have control of Parliament through the offering of jobs in the court. So why would they have found that particularly attractive? And then there's the looming omnipresence of George Washington, that the convention was not behind a Rawlsian veil of ignorance. Everybody knew that George Washington, who was essential, absolutely essential, to having a convention in the first place and getting a new constitution adopted, would become the first leader. So the discussions kind of presumed a gubernatorial / presidential system. It's safe to say that nobody in 1787 had the slightest conception of what the American presidency would turn into, for better and for worse. But, I mean, this is one reason why I describe myself, I hope sincerely, as not engaging in founder bashing. And that doesn't mean lack of sympathy with Daniel Shays, but it does mean that I don't blame them for not being alive in 2010. They were responding to the problems of their own time, and in many ways did a very impressive job. In some ways, not so impressive. But that's not really the point. The point is our own political world. And again, if I can conclude by citing scripture, it's James Madison himself who concludes the 14th Federalist paper very, very eloquently by saying that we always ought to be willing to learn the lessons of experience, by saying that the greatness of the United States is precisely that it was willing to engage in a revolution in 1776 and to embark into a new world that had not ever been thoroughly theorized or certainly thoroughly enacted. And they did it anyway. And for that, I honor them, genuinely. But what I find bizarre and objectionable is that we've ended up engaging in a form of ancestor worship of people, one of whose central messages is that we shouldn't engage in ancestor worship. We should think for ourselves and try to design institutions adequate for our time. And that's where I am genuinely and deeply willing to embrace James Madison, even if in many, many ways I think that the Constitution he helped to impose on us is dangerously dysfunctional in 2010.